Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on a really critical mission. We're going to be synthesizing the insights from Chapter 13 of Cosmos. And this is a chapter that it really demands we confront our place in the universe.
Yeah.
And our very, very precarious future.
It's a deep dive into what is maybe the ultimate tension. We've somehow managed, in just this tiny flicker of our existence, to grasp the true scale of the universe. I mean, billions of galaxies, mind-boggling timescales.
Right.
But then you have this cosmic perspective set against, well, the terrifying backdrop of our own self-destructive tendencies. Right here, on this one planet.
Exactly. And the chapter, it just throws us right back in time to set that scale. You have Anaximenes, around 600 BC, asking this painful question to Pythagoras. Why search for the secrets of the stars when, death or slavery is always right in front of my eyes?
It's the classic question, isn't it? Do you focus on the local suffering or the cosmic understanding? And then centuries later, you get Christian Huygens in 1690, and he's reflecting on how minuscule the Earth is. He calls it an inconsiderable spot.
A spot where King Sacrifice lives for, what was it, a pitiful corner of land?
A pitiful corner, yeah. So these thinkers, hundreds of years apart, they both saw how absurd our little conflicts look from a distance.
And the thing that connects us to that distance is this realization that humanity really only discovered the universe only yesterday. I mean, for a million years, we were completely self-centered. Then, in just the last 0.1% of our species' lifetime, we suddenly realized we're just a speck.
And what's so fascinating is what that knowledge implies, that we're literally made of stellar ash. The source material points out that our origins are tied to these titanic cosmic events. Hydrogen atoms, made in the Big Bang, cooked into heavy elements inside stars.
So it means, on some fundamental level, something inside us recognizes the cosmos as home, because we're made of it. Okay, so let's unpack this. If we are star stuff, if we have this amazing lineage and this soaring, passionate intelligence that can grasp galaxies, why do we accumulate what the text calls dangerous evolutionary baggage? Why is self-destruction still, on the table?
Well, that baggage is the central flaw that this chapter just keeps exploring. We carry these deep hereditary propensities, things like aggression, ritual submission to leaders, hostility to outsiders.
Things that were useful once.
Exactly. They were useful when we were small tribal groups fighting over scarce resources. But now
Now they're catastrophically outdated.
Precisely. They are balanced by our evolved tools for survival compassion, love for our children, and maybe most importantly, reason. The great challenge is that we have to adapt our ancient emotional hardware to modern global responsibilities. And we have to do it, right now.
And the chapter suggests the best way to force that adaptation is perspective.
Yeah.
Travel is broadening, but nothing compares to seeing Earth from space. The boundaries, the fences, all those imaginary lines we fight over, they just vanish.
Oh, absolutely. Think about that visual. Astronauts who have been in orbit, they all say the same thing. National boundaries are not evident from up there. All the political, ethnic, religious chauvinisms that fuel our conflicts, they become genuinely difficult to maintain when you see the planet as a fragile blue crescent.
Or even smaller, just an inconspicuous point of light.
Right, against this enormous blackness. It's the ultimate antidote to provincialism.
But that moment of perspective, it leads to a really terrifying question, one that we have to address. Since we don't see any obvious signs of, widespread extraterrestrial civilizations, the source forces us to confront the possibility. Do civilizations like ours always rush headlong toward self-destruction? Do they wipe themselves out before they can really mature?
That is the ghost in the machine. It really is. We are fortunate, we're powerful, we are the local embodiment of the cosmos thinking about itself. And if we don't speak for Earth, who will? The survival of our species, the great venture of breaking the shackles of Earth, both by literally voyaging to planets and metaphorically confronting our own primitive brains, they are necessary, and they're indissolubly linked.
And yet we're still caught in this kind of mass self-hypnosis. Instead of putting our energy into life and expansion, our focus is still on war, driven by this deep mutual mistrust.
And that avoidance is its own kind of danger. The text says what we do not consider we are unlikely to put right. We have to force ourselves to look. Which brings us directly into the stark reality of modern warfare and this chain of nuclear proliferation.
It reads almost like a predictable historical law. Once the secret was out, it was just a matter of time. You see this dreary chain of causality. The Germans, Americans, Soviets, British, French, Chinese, Indians, Pakistanis.
And the technology gets easier, material becomes easier to get, it degrades into what the chapter calls almost a home handicraft industry.
The scale, though, that's where the modern reality really hits. And we have to use the specific details here, otherwise the numbers just, they don't mean anything.
You're right. So think back to World War II. The total destructive power of all the conventional bombs dropped on all the cities. Coventry, Dresden, Tokyo, added up to about 2 megatons of TNT. 2 million tons spread over 6 years of global war.
6 years. And that was a staggering amount of destruction. But then the source makes a comparison to the late 20th century.
Yes. By that time, a single thermonuclear bomb could hold the destructive force of 2 megatons. Just one. And the total strategic arsenal was well over 10,000 megatons of destruction.
And it could all be delivered not over 6 years, but a few hours.
A few hours. That's statistic. A blockbuster for every single family on the planet. It's meant to shock us into seeing the reality.
And the human cost of just a tiny fraction of that power is, well, it's almost unbearable. We hear the account from the Hiroshima schoolgirl who survived. She described the immediate aftermath. The darkness, the voices calling for mothers.
The sight of people with singed, frizzled hair who did not appear to be human. Yeah, that first-hand witness is so critical. And we have to remember that was just the blast effect. The long-term consequences, the residual radiation, that's even more terrifyingly persistent.
Like the 1954 bikini test.
Yeah.
A 15 megaton yield. It deposited radioactive ash like snow on the island of Rongelap, which was 150 kilometers away.
And the people there, they suffered horrific consequences. Thyroid abnormalities, growth retardation, malignant tumors. And these poisons, they don't just go away.
No, they're intergenerational pollutants. We're talking about things like strontium-90, which takes 96 years for 90% of it to decay. And cesium-137, that's 100 years. This isn't just about one tragedy. It's about poisoning the ground for centuries.
And if you scale that up to a full global exchange, the environmental catastrophe is truly planetary. It's not just the blast. It's the long, slow death of the entire ecosystem. The enormous heat would create nitrogen oxides that would just shred the ozone layer.
Emitting intense solar ultraviolet radiation for years.
For years. And that UV radiation, it means skin cancer for survivors, sure, but the real catastrophe is ecological. It destroys crops, it kills the microorganisms at the very base of the food chain. Then you've got the dust kicked up, reflecting sunlight, causing a nuclear winter, a total agricultural disaster.
And on top of all that, the biological breakdown. Radiation just debilitates the body's immune system.
And given that the plague bacillus is endemic all over the Earth, a global population with no resistance would face these horrific secondary plagues. And if you survive all of that, you still have the long-term legacy of mutations, tumors, and malformed children.
So we have the capacity for global self-inflicted extinction. The next logical step, then, is trying to understand why. Why are we driven to this? And to do that, the source introduces us to L.F. Richardson.
Richardson was a British meteorologist, and his approach was really unique. He decided to study war as if it were a natural system, like the weather, something that could be understood, maybe even controlled if you just gathered enough data.
He quantified conflicts with an index, M, based on the number of deaths. And his key finding in the Statistics of Deadly Quarrels, it was really counterintuitive, wasn't it?
It was. He found that the more people killed in a war, the less likely that war was to occur. It's like how violent storms are much less frequent than gentle showers.
But the deeper conclusion was chilling.
It was. Richardson found that individual killings, murder, M equals 0, happening globally every 5 minutes, and mass warfare were two ends of an unbroken continuum. War is simply murder writ large.
Driven by the same primitive impulses. It's the difference between one person flying into a murderous rage and an entire nation state doing the same thing. Which brings the conflict down to the actual physical structure of our brain.
It does. We have to look at what's called the R complex, the reptilian brain we share with lizards and crocodiles. This ancient part of our brain governs those fundamental behaviors: aggression, territoriality, ritual submission.
And how does that R complex interact with the newer parts of our brain? The limbic system, the cerebral cortex, the parts that manage reason and compassion.
Well, that's the essential conflict of our time. When we were primitive, an enraged warrior could only kill a few people with a rock. The art complex could run wild, but the damage was contained. But now, that same ancient rage is hooked up to a thermonuclear arsenal.
Our technology has just wildly outpaced our emotional development.
And the ultimate irony is in the strategy of nuclear deterrence itself. The whole doctrine relies on primitive behavior, on mutually assured destruction.
Henry Kissinger was quoted on this, wasn't he? He noted that deterrence depends on the psychological criteria of a bluff taken seriously.
Exactly. And to make that bluff credible, nations adopt this occasional pose of irrationality. The idea that we might just be crazy enough to launch. The danger, as the chapter warns, is that after a while, that pretense can become a devastating reality.
So if the solution isn't rational behavior from the art complex, how do we foster the reason and compassion we need? The chapter offers a really fascinating sociological answer, looking at James W. Prescott's cross-cultural analysis.
Prescott's findings are amazing. He looked at 400 pre-industrial societies, and he found that culture plays a massive role in whether that aggression gene gets activated. Cultures that lavish physical affection on infants, lots of touching, hugging, tenderness, and tolerate adolescent sexuality, they have only a 2% chance of becoming physically violent.
Wow, only 2%, and the opposite.
Conversely, societies where infants are physically punished, where there's strong sexual repression, they tend towards slavery, frequent killing, misogyny, and often believe in these intervening, judgmental, supernatural beings. The practical takeaway the source offers is, well, it's both simple and profound.
Hugging our infants tenderly is a non-controversial contribution to world peace.
That's it. It's an incredible connection between our most intimate actions and global stability.
It really is. Okay, let's pivot to a historical cautionary tale. The chapter looks at a civilization that reached soaring intellectual heights, but completely failed to apply its intelligence to its social structure, the Library of Alexandria.
Alexandria, 2,000 years ago, was truly the brain and heart of the ancient world. The commitment to knowledge was absolute. There's the famous story of Ptolemy III Euergetes, who valued scrolls more than gold. He actually forfeited an enormous cash deposit to the Athenians just so he could keep the original tragedies of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides.
And their scientific achievements, they basically laid the foundation for modern science. Can you remind us of some of the minds working there?
Oh, certainly. This was the place where Eratosthenes accurately calculated the size of the Earth, mapped it, and suggested you could sail west to get to India. Hipparchus cataloged the stars and figured out that they are born, they move, and they perish. Euclid produced the geometry textbook that was used for 23 centuries. These were the true cosmopolitans, citizens of the cosmos.
So why did this brilliant light fail? And here's where the critical insight is. The scientists and scholars, for all their genius, never seriously challenged the political, economic, and religious assumptions of their society.
That is the tragedy. They questioned the permanence of the stars, but not the justice of slavery. And because they stayed separate from public life, their new findings were never popularized. Discoveries in mechanics, like early steam technology, were just used for the amusement of kings or to make better weapons.
Science never captured the public imagination.
It didn't. And when science loses public support, it has no defense against fundamentalism. That failure ultimately culminated in the tragic end of Hypatia.
The last great scientist at the library. A mathematician, astronomer, philosopher.
Around 370 AD.
Yes, and she was publicly attacked by a fanatical mob. They dragged her from her chariot, flayed her with abalone shells until she died, and then her works were systematically destroyed. Obliterated.
The loss was just incalculable. It was a self-inflicted brain surgery on civilization. We know that of the 123 plays Sophocles wrote, only 7 survived. That gives you a sense of the dark age that followed.
And we have to learn from Alexandria. The survival of our civilization requires that our intelligence is applied not just to understanding the stars, but to solving our most urgent social and political problems.
Which brings us right back to the choice we face today, the universe or nothing. If we commit to survival, science is the best tool we have because it's fundamentally self-correcting. It's built on 2 uncompromising rules. 1, there are no sacred truths. Arguments from authority are worthless, and all assumptions have to be critically examined. And 2, whatever is inconsistent with the facts must be discarded or revised. It's a mechanism for getting to the truth, not just finding comfortable certainty.
And what that self-correcting science has revealed is this epic 15-billion-year cosmic evolution. A journey from the Big Bang right up to us.
It's a miraculous story. Hydrogen atoms form, they clump together into stars. Stellar fire forges the heavy elements. Those elements form planets like Earth. The primordial soup gives rise to self-replication. Eventually, you get sex and eyes and ears. The cosmos can finally see and hear itself.
These are some of the things that hydrogen atoms do, given 15 billion years of cosmic evolution, and the Darwinian lesson from that story is so crucial for understanding our responsibility. There will be no humans elsewhere, only here.
We are a rare and endangered species. The differences among us, our politics, skin color, beliefs, they are so trivial compared to our similarities. The source says, if a human disagrees with you, let him live. In 100 billion galaxies, you will not find another.
So the path forward is clear. We have to redirect the instruments of death toward the enterprise of life. The choice is, it's ironically simple. The same rocket boosters used to launch nuclear warheads can launch probes to the planets.
We have to invest our immense energies in an enterprise devoted to life. Space exploration uses the exact same skills, the same valor, the daring, the resources that we pour into war, but it would be an untainted enterprise.
And the cost comparison is staggering when you look at it. The chapter highlights the entire budget for planetary science is trivial compared to military waste. The cost overruns on a single aircraft system in 1 year were greater than the entire Viking mission to Mars.
Our priorities are just fundamentally upside down. We have to shift that loyalty. You can see the footprints of our journey. The 3.6 million-year-old hominid footprints found in Tanzania, and the footprint left by the first human on the moon. We've progressed so far.
Ultimately, we've moved to become the local embodiment of a cosmos that has grown to self-awareness. We are star stuff pondering the stars, but we are still so dangerously divided. Our ultimate loyalties have to broaden beyond nation-states to the entire human community, to the planet Earth.
The choice is clearly the universe or nothing. Our obligation to survive, it isn't just owed to ourselves, it's owed to that cosmos, ancient and vast, from which we spring. We are the mechanism by which the universe knows itself, and that knowledge has to guarantee our survival.
We have the capacity right now to commit our intelligence to making sure that statistical curve of deadly quarrels doesn't veer toward global self-destruction. So what is the most immediate, concrete step you can take in your own sphere of influence to prove that our soaring, passionate intelligence has truly prevailed over our reptilian rage? That is the question this deep dive leaves with you. Thank you for exploring this pivotal chapter with us.